Just to give you some perspective on Orange County, what is Orange County? We are a county with a population of about 1.3 million. By population, we're about the 5th largest in the state of Florida, and with a land area of nearly 1,000 square miles. We include 13 municipalities, so our cities and towns are certainly partners with us as we talk about transportation. And an interesting statistic is that approximately 87% of our residents live here in the county and work in this county. So obviously transportation is important. We enjoy as a county one of the lowest millage rates in the state of Florida, as you can see here on this slide. We're at 4.4347, which is certainly an important component of our conversations going forward. And so I want to start with just giving you a broad overview of how transportation is currently funded in Orange County. We basically have 5 primary funding sources. Some of our traditional transportation funding sources are the gas tax, so that is the tax that we pay when we fuel up our cars. We have impact fees that are paid by developers to address some of the impacts that development has on our network. There are some restricted sources that we use that have a defined purpose. In this case, that defined purpose relates to transportation programs. And then, of course, we have property tax and sales tax, which really more recently have been used to supplement the traditional funding sources of gas tax and impact fees, because those have not met the needs. And so you may ask, how is that transportation funding actually currently utilized? And I'll talk a little bit about some of our transportation program. There are some primary components that I want to speak about this evening, roadways being one of them. Resurfacing, because when we invest in infrastructure, we obviously have to maintain it, and resurfacing is a component of that. Then I'll talk a bit about traffic signals and intersection improvements, bicycle and pedestrian safety, street lighting, and transit. So our inventory of roadways in the county spans about 2,700 miles. So there are 2,700 miles of roadways that Orange County is responsible for. Just to put into perspective the level of investment that we need to make in those roads as we increase capacity, it costs about $3 million, and actually in excess of $3 million per lane mile to build a roadway. If you put that in the perspective of a 4-lane roadway, which we may typically drive on, that means it costs more than $12 million per mile to build a 4-lane roadway. In looking at our existing conditions, approximately 1 out of every 4 roadways is failing. And that means that if you were giving it a letter grade in school, it would be receiving an F because it's operating above the capacity. As I mentioned, we do have a maintenance program that is associated with those 2,700 miles. And the most visible maintenance that you see would be the actual resurfacing or repaving of those roadways. Right now, we're doing that about once every 12 to 15 years. That cost is about $175,000 per mile. And when you look at our current program, we are resurfacing about 185 miles of roadway just this past year. But the reality is we know that we need to increase the frequency of that resurfacing in order to keep up with the lifespan of the pavement itself and to avoid higher costs associated with the roads deteriorating. So when I say that, I mean rather than looking at a 12 to 15 year cycle, we really need to be looking at something closer to 10 to 12 years. And in that case, that would result in our need to resurface about 270 miles in comparison to the 185 that we're able to do right now. Now let's talk a bit about traffic signals and intersection improvements. One thing that I want to make clear is, first of all, we have an expansive inventory. We have 585 existing traffic signals within the county. The cost to install a new traffic signal is about $350,000 per traffic signal. And related to that is the technology that goes along with all of these signal systems being able to communicate. And so we've just last year, as an example, installed 240 miles of fiber optic cable to support those signal systems and other communication. The existing intersection improvement program was about 15 locations this past budget. One thing to point out when we talk about traffic congestion is many times we experience traffic congestion on the roadway itself, but oftentimes the traffic congestion we experience is at the intersection, because intersections themselves have a certain amount of capacity, and we know there are a number of unmet needs relative to intersection capacity beyond just our roadway segments. Moving on to bicycle and pedestrian safety, we know that is an important topic that we've heard about in the past from the community and certainly from our perspective. Thinking about a sidewalk, the average sidewalk costs about $264,000 per mile to install. We were able to install about 8 miles of sidewalk last year. We also know the importance of bicycle lanes and have installed those in some of our roadway corridors. And we often hear about bicycle trails, and we do have an existing trail system to the tune of about 46 miles of trail. We have completed a bicycle pedestrian safety action plan that helps define some of those safety-related needs and priorities based on accident data, and we will be continuing to develop priorities moving forward for bicycle and pedestrian safety. Street lighting is also an important topic from a safety perspective that we want to touch on this evening. We have a street lighting program that is associated with the major roadway corridors. Our existing 5-year program, which we are on the tail end of, will ultimately result in about 85 miles being completed. However, we know there is an unmet need that exceeds 190 miles of unlit major corridors within our community. And so from a safety perspective, we know we have a need to meet those unmet needs. There are also additional lighting needs at intersections and crosswalks with a focus on pedestrian safety that we will be identifying. And lastly, I want to touch on transit, mass transit. To paint the picture of our current scenario, Links is funded by the county, and Mr. Harrison will be up momentarily to share more about Links. It's currently funded by the county utilizing property tax revenues. So your property taxes we utilize to support the Links system. We also know that SunRail operations in the near future will ultimately transfer from the Florida Department of Transportation to local governments in terms of our responsibility going forward. And then there have been a number of other additional mass transit options that have been studied in the past, and those studies have ultimately not resulted in implementation based on financial constraints.